Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Steven here, Northwest Small Batch Brewing. And today I got another brew talk. I am in the middle of brewing a beer, and so I'm not ready to show you yet the final. So we'll talk about something about beer in the meantime. Yeah. Anyway, so today's brew talk is probably going to be short. Now, if I ever want a beer video to be short, meaning not a long video, right? All I have to say is it's going to be a short one, and it definitely will not be. So we'll see how that goes. So this is going to be a video just explaining brewing methods, really. In fact, we're going to talk about mash methods, and here's why. So a lot has changed over the years, right? Even what we use to brew our beer has changed over the years. We've gone from, 3-vessel systems. If you guys recall, some of the old folks like me know about the igloo coolers that you would mash in. Some people had Herm systems. Some people still do have all these things, and they work just fine, by the way. It's not that they make bad beer or that they don't work. It's just, technology has come a long way, and we now are able to make beer in a single vessel and hold the temperature. I mean, it's become easier to brew beer. Anyway, my point is, sometimes you're looking at recipes, right? You want to make a particular beer, and maybe you're looking at recipes in a book or online or something, and you find these recipes that just don't make sense. If you're new to brewing, you may just be using, an all-in-one brewing system, and you're doing a full volume mash, and the recipes are just not making sense to you. Like, how can you make it work for your system? If you don't understand what the recipe is saying. So in this case, I want to talk about mashing, right? So in the old days, they made or they had a system called Multistep mash infusion. Blech, there's a mouthful. Multi-step mash infusion. And there was a real good reason for it. So the way it worked was you had multiple temperature stops during your mash. Cheers, by the way. Wow, I got like this whiff of Lorna Doone off of this beer, like big time. Interesting. This is a good beer, by the way. This is Pelican Brewing down on the Oregon coast. This is their blonde ale. Anyway, so multiple temperature stops. So maybe you start at a very low temperature, and once you're at that temperature, you hold it for, like, let's say, I'm making this up, but let's say 20 minutes. Then you move it up to the next level, the next temperature. And when it gets there, you hold it for 20 minutes. And you continue this, right? There's usually like 4 different temperature stops in a multi-step temperature infusion or mash infusion. And the reason for this was because originally, back in the day, this wasn't that long ago, grain was not that well modified. What that means is, I think most of us who brew beer understand that the sugar comes from the grain, right? But the grain is starch, right? So you've got the grain, that's starch. How does it turn into sugar? Well, there's natural enzymes. It's Mother Nature, right? There's enzymes built into each grain of barley. So when it reaches a certain temperature, kind of like the sun and springtime warming up, it's basically a key that unlocks that grain and says, oh, it's time to wake up. And it releases this enzyme that breaks down the starch that's in that kernel into sugar. And that sugar is meant to be food, the initial food and building block for that growth, for it to become a plant. But instead, we're stealing that sugar for ourselves to make beer. So we're plant killers, basically. Right. So back in the day, your barley didn't convert sugar that well, right? The enzymes did not convert the sugar as well as it does today. And so you have these different temperature stops because at each temperature range, different things happen. And it allowed time for the grain to break down more and the enzymes to have more time to work at different, temperature ranges. And so you had these different stops. So you will find recipes still because that's how they did it, right? So the recipe is written in that fashion. So if you come across a recipe and it's talking about multiple temperature ranges or stops during your mash, it's probably one of these old recipes, and you don't need to do those temperature stops anymore. Now there is another kind of temperature stop that people do for different reasons. And I don't really want to get into that for this video. But there are times where they'll take some of the wort out and you'll boil it separately and then put it back in. But I would say for the majority of the time, if you're looking at a recipe and it's got like 4 different temperature stops during the mash, you can just mash in at your top mash temperature and call it good for the whole mash. Now, why is that? Because these days, we don't do multi-step mash infusions. We do single-step mash infusion. Single step is just like I just said, right? It's a single temperature, one step, and the infusion mash, you're dunking, you're basically soaking or whatever the grain in the water to extract, the sugar at the temperature that it needs to be at. The reason you can do that is because today's grain is highly modified and it has very high diastatic power. That means that you're going to get the maximum amount of sugar. The enzymes are going to be able to react and pull the maximum amount of sugar out of those grains. They've been modified to be able to do that. So it makes it easier, and you get a more guaranteed gravity at the end of your mash because it's, more dialed in. So unless you're using grain that's very old, that hasn't been modified, which is probably unlikely, you can just do a single step mash. So one last thing I want to say, and that is that if you ever wonder about certain grains, adjuncts, and why we use them, torrefied wheat, flaked wheat, flaked barley, gelatinized. Gelatinized is the word. Basically, you take oats, wheat, barley, rye, and it's cooked, basically. It's rolled and cooked and gelatinized. And the reason is because it allows you to get some conversion from it, right? If you put in raw oats, they are not going to convert very well because they're just not. Even when the enzymes that we have from your base malt, it just is not going to convert that well. Which is why a lot of times when you see a recipe calling for wheat or rye or oats, you're going to see something like flaked oats or torrefied or something like that, because that means they've already been kind of gelatinized and steamed and pre-cooked, and they're all set to go. So that way you're skipping all those different step mashes in order to get the most out of them, because they've done that for you, basically. Anyway, hopefully that made some sense. I don't know, but if you are coming across some old recipes, that might help make some sense for you and let you still use the recipe. Anyway, I'll be back in another week for another video, and until then, keep on brewing.